Ziegler looked at the tree line, then at the woman standing behind him waiting for orders, and made the decision that would cost him everything he thought he understood about this war. "She's slowing us down," he said. "Leave her." He said it the way men like Ziegler said things they'd already decided. Not as a question, not as a debate, just as a fact being announced to a universe expected to comply. Then he turned back toward the valley and started moving, and the rest of the patrol followed, because that was what patrols did when the man with the rank made the call. Sergeant First Class Adrienne Colt heard the boots leaving. She didn't call out. She didn't beg. She lay face down in the mud at the edge of a drainage ditch in the Panjshir Valley with 3 cracked ribs, a dislocated shoulder she'd reset herself 20 minutes earlier by bracing against a tree and not screaming, and a bullet that had passed clean through the meat of her left side and was no longer her immediate problem, medically speaking. She breathed. She counted. She waited until the sound of the patrol was fully gone. Then she started thinking, what do I have? What do I need? What is the first step? She'd been using that sequence since her second deployment when a training sergeant at Gagetown had told her that panic was just math done in the wrong order. You start with feelings, he said. You get feelings. You start with inventory. You get options. Colt had never forgotten it, which was useful, because right now feelings were abundant and options were what she needed, what she had. Her rifle, a C8 with a thermal optic and 11 rounds remaining, a sidearm with 1 spare magazine, a field dressing already applied to the through and through on her left side, a radio that had taken shrapnel and was producing static on every frequency she tried, 3 cracked ribs that made breathing a negotiation, 1 shoulder that was technically in its socket but was very openly discussing the possibility of leaving again, and approximately 4 kilometers of contested valley between her and the firebase where Ziegler was going to file his report. She already knew what that report was going to say. She'd been in enough briefings with enough men like Ziegler to know exactly how the language worked when it needed to. She started moving. It took her 3 minutes to understand that the patrol hadn't just left her behind. They'd left her between 2 things. To the south, toward the firebase and the road and anything resembling extraction, was the tree line where the ambush had originated. Someone was still there. She could hear them, the specific cadence of men who believed they'd won and were doing the slow, unhurried work of confirming it. To the north, up the slope and into the ridgeline, was a compound she'd spent 2 days studying on satellite imagery before the mission. Enemy aligned, permanent structure, communications array on the roof, vehicle pool on the eastern side. She knew the layout, the way she knew the layout of the armory at CFB Petawawa, not because she'd been inside it, but because she'd done the work. Colt assessed the tree line, assessed the compound, assessed her 11 rounds and her static radio and her cracked ribs and the 4 kilometers of ground she could not cross without dying. Then she turned north. Because here was the thing about Adrienne Colt, the thing that had never quite fit into any performance review or unit assessment or the careful language that senior officers used when they were trying to describe someone they didn't entirely know how to categorize. She did not have a survival instinct in the conventional sense. She had an objective instinct. She didn't think, how do I get out of this? She thought, what was I sent here to do, and who said it was finished? Nobody had said it was finished. Ziegler had said she was slowing them down, which was a different thing entirely. The compound was 1.5 kilometers up the slope. She covered it in 40 minutes, moving the way she'd been trained to move since she was 22 years old, and had shown up at her first posting with scores from the basic qualification range that her range instructor had made her reshoot twice before he'd believed them. Not because there was anything wrong with the scores, because the scores meant something he wasn't prepared for, and repetition was how some people bought time to revise their expectations. She'd learned to move quietly, partly from training, and partly from 9 years of navigating rooms where people needed a moment to catch up to what they were seeing. At the outer wall of the compound, she stopped and watched for 8 minutes. 2 sentries on the roofline, 1 at the gate, patrol interval irregular. She clocked it at somewhere between 4 and 7 minutes, which told her the discipline here was functional but not rigorous. The kind of discipline that came from confidence. They weren't expecting company. They'd watched a Canadian patrol turn around and leave 40 minutes ago. Nobody expected the one who'd been left behind to come uphill. She took the gate sentry first, from behind with the butt of her sidearm, the specific sequence her close quarters instructor at Dwyer Hill had drilled until it stopped being a sequence and became a reflex. The man went down without a sound. She pulled him into the shadow of the wall and kept moving. The two roofline sentries were harder. She tracked them for 4 more minutes, mapping the gap in their overlap. And when the gap opened, she moved across the open ground in the low broken run that her ribs screamed at her about for the next 10 minutes. She was inside the courtyard before they came back into mutual visual range. 7 rounds remaining. She preferred not to use them yet. The communications building was exactly where the satellite imagery had placed it. Low, concrete, generator on the south wall humming loud enough to cover her approach. She went in through the window rather than the door, landing on her good side and coming up fast, and the 2 operators inside had time to register that something had entered the room before she was already across it. 1 round. She used 1 round into the radio console itself because a destroyed transmitter was more useful to her than 2 unconscious men and an intact one. The remaining operator, young, startled, more frightened than combative, she put in the corner with zip ties from her kit and told him clearly to stay there. She looked at what was left of the console. There was a secondary set mounted on the wall. Older, military surplus, Soviet-era hardware, the kind that showed up in compounds like this because it was robust and hard to jam and the people who used it had learned its frequencies by rote. She knew this model. She'd trained on its NATO equivalent at a signals course in Kingston 3 years ago, a week she'd spent mostly being the only woman in the room and partly learning more about Cold War-era radio architecture than she'd expected to use. She sat down in front of it and started working. The patrol's original mission had been reconnaissance. Confirm the presence of a weapons cache at this compound. Get eyes on the eastern vehicle pool. Relay coordinates for a follow-on strike package and extract. Ziegler had pulled the patrol when the ambush hit them in the valley, before they'd gotten within visual range of the eastern pool, before they'd confirmed anything. The mission, in other words, was not complete. Colt looked around the room. There was a map on the wall, hand-drawn, annotated in Dari, which she didn't speak, but military maps had a grammar that transcended language. She could read the grid lines, the unit markers, the arrows. She could read the timing notations on the vehicle pool marker, and what she read made her stop moving entirely for 3 seconds. The vehicle pool wasn't a cache, it was a transit point, and based on the timing notation on the map, she cross-referenced it twice against her watch to be certain. There was a convoy scheduled to move through this compound in approximately 90 minutes, heading south toward the road, toward the positions that the patrol had been sent to protect. She didn't know the full picture. She didn't know what was in the convoy exactly, though the markers on the map suggested it wasn't food. She didn't know whether anyone on the Canadian side of the valley knew this was coming. She knew that she was the only person in a position to tell them. She got on the secondary radio. Getting to a coalition frequency took her 6 minutes, 6 minutes of cycling through bands, cross-referencing what she remembered from Kingston, adjusting for the altitude degradation on the signal. When she finally broke through, the voice on the other end was a duty officer she didn't know, someone from a forward operations element to the south, and the conversation was brief because she made it brief. Colt, Sergeant First Class, 3rd Battalion, PPCLI. She gave her call sign. She gave her grid. She gave the timing on the convoy and the direction of travel and the approximate grid for the vehicle pool. She asked for confirmation. The duty officer asked for authentication. She gave it. She was precise about the authentication because she'd learned early in her career that precision in administrative details was what got you taken seriously when you were calling from a position that shouldn't be possible. The duty officer said, "Stand by." She stood by and used the time to look more carefully at the map. There was a notation in the lower corner. A name, she thought, or a designation. She couldn't read the Dari script, but underneath it, in what looked like a different handwriting, was a transliteration in Roman letters. A name she recognized. Not from this compound, not from this valley. From a briefing 3 weeks ago. From a targeting package that had been flagged as inconclusive and shelved pending further intelligence. She had just found the further intelligence. She pulled the map off the wall, folded it carefully, and put it inside her jacket. The duty officer came back on. His voice had changed. That particular shift, she'd heard it before, the adjustment that happened when routine became urgent, and the person on the other end stopped processing and started acting. He read back her convoy information. He asked for her status. "Functional," she said. She did not elaborate on what functional currently meant, which included 3 cracked ribs, 1 recently relocated shoulder, a through and through that was going to need real attention in the next few hours, and a radio she'd requisitioned from an enemy compound. These were real things. They were also not the duty officer's immediate problem. She signed off, checked her watch. 68 minutes until the convoy moved. There was something she hadn't told the duty officer yet, because she'd read the map again while she was talking and found something she needed to be certain about before she transmitted it. A secondary notation on the vehicle pool marker, small. The kind of detail that got added after the fact, in different ink. The convoy was not originating here, it was passing through. The origin point was marked 2 kilometers northwest, in a location the satellite imagery had flagged as agricultural, a compound that looked like a farm, that had been assessed as non-military in the last 3 intelligence reviews. Someone had assessed it wrong, or someone had assessed it correctly and then changed the assessment. She sat with that distinction for a moment. Then, she got back on the radio. The duty officer sounded mildly alarmed when she came back on. She gave him the origin point. She gave him the secondary notation. She told him to pull the last 3 intelligence assessments on grid reference 904 Alpha and look at who had signed the revisions. He asked how she knew about the revisions. She said the map in front of her told her there had been revisions, because origin points that get added in different ink after the fact are origin points that weren't in the original intelligence picture, which meant someone had acquired that information after the original assessment was filed, which meant there was a question about when and how and why it hadn't surfaced through standard channels. A long pause. She understood what the pause meant. She'd been in enough rooms to know the sound of someone recalibrating. 52 minutes. She left the communications building and moved into the compound's central courtyard. Her ribs had stopped the sharp phase and moved into the low continuous phase, which was medically ambiguous but tactically manageable. Her shoulder was holding. The through and through had slowed. The field dressing was doing its job. She was running on something that wasn't quite adrenaline anymore and wasn't quite stubbornness. The space between them. She'd been running on it since she was 22 years old, and she knew how to work with it. The eastern vehicle pool was 40 meters across the courtyard. She'd been sent here to get eyes on it. Nobody had told her to stop. She crossed the courtyard in 2 stages, using the generator housing and then the wall of what appeared to be a storage building for cover. The compound's remaining personnel were concentrated near the gate, as far as she could tell. She'd heard voices there since she'd come inside. The ordinary sounds of men who didn't know their security had been compromised and were going about the slow business of a night watch. The vehicle pool was covered by a metal roof on open sides. 3 trucks, one older, one newer, one that was neither truck nor anything she immediately had a category for. A flatbed with a frame structure that she photographed with the camera mounted on her rifle's optic, because documentation was why reconnaissance existed. She spent 4 minutes at the vehicle pool, and what she found there moved the map in her jacket from interesting intelligence to urgent intelligence. The convoy wasn't carrying weapons in the conventional sense. The frame structures on the flatbeds were consistent with launch rails she'd seen in a targeting briefing 18 months ago on a completely different theater. The briefing had been classified, and she hadn't been supposed to be in the room. She'd been delivering something to a duty officer, and the door had been open, and her memory was, as multiple range instructors had noted over the years, precise. She got back on the radio for the 3rd time. This call was shorter, and the duty officer's voice was different again. Not the urgency of the second call, but something tighter than that. The quality of a person who has received 2 successive pieces of information that have revised his understanding of what kind of night this is. She described what she was looking at. She was precise. She used the correct designations from the briefing she'd been not supposed to attend, and she heard the duty officer go very still on the other end. "Are you certain?" he said. "I'm looking at it," she said. "What is your current position?" she told him. He said, "Colt, I need you to hold that position if you can." "We're moving assets," she said. "Define hold." He said, 30 minutes. "Can you give us 30 minutes? She did the math. 30 minutes was 12 minutes before the convoy moved. If she could create 12 minutes of additional delay on the convoy's departure, create enough uncertainty inside this compound that the timeline slipped, the assets would arrive before the flatbeds left the yard. She said she'd work with it, and she signed off before he could ask follow-up questions, because the answers to the follow-up questions were going to make him nervous, and she needed him focused. What she had: 7 rounds, 1 grenade she'd been carrying since Fob Gracefield and had not yet used, a compound that didn't know she was inside it, and 12 minutes she needed to manufacture from nothing. She looked at the vehicle pool. She looked at the fuel lines on the 3 trucks, the specific routing of them, the connection points, the distance between the Nishir's vehicle and the generator housing on the south wall. Her demolitions instructor at Dwyer Hill had said, "You don't destroy the thing you need someone else to find. You make the thing impossible to move." Those are different problems with different solutions, and confusing them is how you waste resources you don't have. She didn't destroy the trucks. She spent 4 minutes on each fuel line, making specific modifications that were not immediately visible and would not cause an immediate failure, but would cause a failure at approximately the 45-second mark after ignition, which was after the vehicles left the motor pool, but before they reached the compound gate. Then she moved to the generator housing and used the last of the cord from her kit to rig the grenade to the generator's external control panel, with a simple delay that she set for 11 minutes from now. Not to destroy the generator. To make the generator stop, which would take out the lights, which would produce approximately 90 seconds of compound-wide disorientation while the backup system cycled. 90 seconds was not a long time. It was long enough. She moved to a position she'd clocked on the way in, a gap in the northern wall, behind a collapsed section of outbuilding, that gave her a line of sight to the vehicle pool and enough cover that a person doing a standard visual sweep of the courtyard would look directly at her location and not find her. She'd been finding positions like this her whole career. She had a talent for occupying space that other people's attention moved past. She waited. At the 9-minute mark, she heard the compound come alive. Not the alarm response kind of alive, the operational kind. Men moving with purpose. Engines being checked. The sounds of a convoy preparing to move on schedule, completely unaware that the schedule was the problem. At the 11-minute mark, the generator stopped. The courtyard went dark, and in the darkness there were voices, lots of them, the particular sound of competent men managing a predictable inconvenience rather than a crisis. They would have the backup online in 90 seconds. Colt was counting. At 70 seconds, the first truck tried to move. It made it exactly 41 seconds past ignition, which was inside the motor pool, but not quite to the exit lane. When the fuel line failed in the way she designed it to fail, not dramatically, just a loss of power, a stall, a vehicle that was going to need attention before it was going anywhere. The driver tried the ignition twice and then began shouting. The second truck, pulling up behind the first, stopped to avoid a collision. The third truck, unable to see past the first 2 in the dark, stopped also. The backup generator came on at 92 seconds. The lights came up on a vehicle pool containing 3 stationary trucks, one driver arguing with another driver, and no visible reason for anyone to check the northern wall. At 15 minutes, she heard the aircraft. Not the sound she'd been expecting, not rotary, not a close air support profile, a different frequency. Something further up the chain than a 30-minute asset response normally produced. The duty officer had made phone calls. She keyed her radio. Colt, vehicle pool is static. 3 trucks unable to move. My grid is unchanged. A new voice on the frequency, not the duty officer. Older, more compressed. The economy of someone who'd been doing this long enough that words were expenditure to be managed. Colt, confirm you are north of the vehicle pool, inside the compound perimeter. Confirmed. Can you move south, outside the wall, within 90 seconds? She looked at the northern gap in the wall. She looked at her ribs and made them a separate problem. She looked at the 12 meters of open ground between her position and the gap. Yes, she said. Move now, the voice said. Mark your position when you're clear. She moved. Her ribs made themselves known in significant ways, and she filed the information under later and crossed the 12 meters and went through the gap in the wall and got 20 meters clear on the southern downslope and pressed the emergency locator on her kit. The strike on the compound was not what she'd imagined from the technical briefings. What she'd imagined was cinematic, sound, light, sequence. What it actually was physics. A change in the way the air in the valley organized itself. A pressure event, felt before heard, that moved through her from the ground up and made the darkness briefly very bright. She lay in the scrub on the slope and counted to 10. She breathed. Then she sat up. The vehicle pool was gone. Most of the compound east wall was gone. The frame structures on the flatbeds were gone, which was the point. More specifically, what they'd been carrying was gone, definitively and irreversibly, in the particular absolute way that made certain intelligence assessments moot. Her radio crackled. Colt. Still here, she said. Extraction inbound. 8 minutes. Can you hold position? Yes, she said. She already had her signal kit out. She set the flare, sat back on the slope, and put her hand against her left side, where the field dressing had held, but was going to need more than that in the near term. Her shoulder ached with the even, established quality of a problem that knew it had time. Her ribs were discussing their situation amongst themselves. She looked at the sky. 8 minutes. She'd been in the valley for approximately 6 hours. In that time, she'd been ambushed, shot, dislocated her own shoulder in a drainage ditch, walked uphill to an enemy compound on 3 cracked ribs, disabled their communications, photographed their vehicle pool, identified a threat that the intelligence picture had missed, bought 12 minutes of convoy delay out of a generator and some field cord, and transmitted enough information that someone with stars on their collar had gotten out of bed and made a decision. The extraction bird came in at minute 9, 1 minute late, which was within acceptable parameters. The medic, who came off first, was a corporal named Tamboli, who moved with the organized efficiency of someone who had read the grid data on the way in and was already running the math. He put his hands on her in the way medics do, that fast, purposeful inventory, and when he got to the through and through, he made the particular medic sound. Not a word, just a controlled exhalation of professional disapproval. I know, she said. Sergeant Colt, I'm going to need you too. I know, she said again. Get me on the bird. He looked at her face. He made the calculation that people tended to make when they encountered the difference between what they were looking at and what they were hearing. Then he got her on the bird. She was conscious for the flight back. She decided this was appropriate, not because she needed to be, but because she'd been in this valley for 6 hours, and it seemed right to see it from the air at least once before she left. Through the window, in the dark, she could see the orange of the compound burning, and below it, further south, the lights of the fire base that Ziegler had gotten back to a couple of hours before she did. She thought about the report he'd filed. She thought about the language it would use. She filed both thoughts under later. At FOB Gracefield, at 0540 hours, she was in the surgical bay before she was fully aware of having arrived at it. The surgeon was a major named TSC, who had the economic movements of someone who did not waste time on anything, including, apparently, small talk. The through and through was straightforward, he said, which was a technical description rather than an emotional reassurance, and she appreciated the precision. The ribs were 3 confirmed fractures and would require a brace and 6 weeks of modified duty. The shoulder was clinically back in position, but had sustained ligament stress that would need physiotherapy. The frostbite-adjacent cold exposure on her hands from the night in the valley was mild and would resolve. She was going to be fine. She woke at 11:10 hours with that particular clarity that comes after a night of sustained high function and a body that had finally been permitted to register what it had been carrying. Everything hurt with the organized precision of a detailed invoice. She didn't move for a moment. She ran the math on where everything hurt, cataloged it, decided she was functional and not in the interesting kind of trouble. The first person in the door was not a nurse. It was Lieutenant Colonel Aveline Shaughnessy, base commander, Joint Task Force structure, who entered with the particular composure of someone who had been up since approximately 0300 and had achieved the kind of calm that lives on the other side of a long night. She had a coffee. She did not offer one, which told Colt something about the topology of this visit. Sergeant Colt, she said. Ma'am, Colt said. She did not try to sit up. She had the external rib brace now, and it made sitting up a considered enterprise. Shaughnessy sat down in the chair beside the bed and looked at her for a moment with the assessment of someone who has reviewed a file and is comparing it to the person. How are you feeling? She said. Functional, Colt said. Your surgeon described you as something he'd have to look up the technical term for. She paused. I believe the phrase he used was beyond the standard distribution. I'll take that. Shaughnessy set her coffee down. Do you know what happened south of your grid this morning, she said, between 0430 and 0600? No, Colt said. She'd been inside the compound for most of that window. Nothing, Shaughnessy said. Nothing happened. A patrol came in. A convoy that was supposed to be 30 kilometers south of where it was destroyed didn't arrive at its destination. 47 personnel at 2 coalition positions, South of the valley finished their watches, ate breakfast, complained about the cold. She paused. 47 people, who were the intended target of what was on those flatbeds. Colt heard the number and let it settle. She hadn't known the number. She'd known there were positions south. She hadn't done the head count math because it wasn't the math that moved the problem forward, and now, here it was, landing with the specific weight of things that are real and irreversible. And do not ask your permission, the map, Shaughnessy said. The one you pulled off the wall. Colt had kept it through the flight and the surgical bay by the simple method of keeping her jacket on until the last moment, at which point Tamboli had pointed at her firmly, and she'd handed the jacket over with the map in the interior pocket and said, "That needs to go to intelligence, not laundry." She thought it made it. "It made it," Shaughnessy said. "Our intelligence section has been working it since 600. There's a name on that map, in the lower corner, the transliteration. You identified it on your third radio transmission." "Yes, that name appears in 3 intelligence assessments over the last 4 months. All 3 were filed as inconclusive. 2 of those files were revised after initial submission." She looked at Colt steadily. The revisions downgraded the threat assessment. Colt waited. She had the sense of a shape becoming visible, the way shapes became visible through a thermal optic. Not all at once, but in increments, each new piece of heat making the outline clearer. "Who revised them?" she said. It wasn't really a question. The map had told her there were revisions. She'd told the duty officer to look at the signatures. She'd been awake for a long time, and she'd had time to think on the flight south. Shaughnessy looked at her. "The investigation into the original assessment revisions." She stopped. Her voice had that careful quality of someone choosing words that were going to matter. "The preliminary findings identify a single point of authorization for both revisions. And the convoy route," Colt said, "the patrol's ground route, filed 48 hours before the mission." Shaughnessy said nothing for a moment. "Then, we're treating that as part of the same investigation." Colt looked at the ceiling. The patrol's route had been filed through Ziegler's chain. She'd seen it go up. She'd been in the briefing room when it was reviewed, which meant the access point was somewhere in that chain. Someone with authorization. Someone who had taken a patrol route and a threat assessment and made decisions about what to do with them that had nothing to do with the mission. Someone who had needed the patrol not to reach that compound. 12 people in that valley, she said. Ziegler had 12 people in the ambush. "I know," Shaughnessy said. "And Ziegler left me behind because a living Colt was going to end up in a room like this one eventually." Shaughnessy held her gaze. "We don't know yet how much Ziegler knew. His statement this morning is under review. There are inconsistencies between his account and 2 members of the patrol." Colt said nothing. She was thinking about Ziegler's voice when he said she's slowing us down. She was thinking about the math. She was thinking about a man who had filed a leave-behind assessment and then walked 4 kilometers to a fire base and written a report. "The investigation is active," Shaughnessy said. "You will be part of it, formally, when you're medically cleared." "I want to be present when you move," Colt said. Shaughnessy looked at her. "Not the interrogation," Colt said. "Not the arrest process. I want to be in the room when the account is settled. I've been in this unit for 3 years. I've sat in briefings where routes were filed. I want to be standing there." A pause. "When you're medically cleared," Shaughnessy said. Rib brace and all, she left. A military intelligence major came in 40 minutes later. He introduced himself as Lebrun. He had the particular quality of a man who had learned to appear less sharp than he was. And Colt recognized it because she'd spent 9 years developing the same skill. He put a tablet on the tray table and turned it to face her. On the screen was a network map. She'd seen maps like this in briefings, but this one was larger than any briefing map she'd encountered. Nodes, connections, frequency signatures, a visual record of something that had been operating for a long time. "The map on your wall," he said, "is one piece of this. We've been tracking pieces of this network for 7 months. He pointed to a node near the center. "This one has been dark since February." He looked at her. "The frequency signature in your compound's transmission logs. We pulled them from the secondary radio you used. Appears twice in our record. Once 8 months ago in the network's establishment traffic. Once in the last 48 hours on a domestic coalition frequency." He paused. "The same signal in both places. Same equipment signature." Colt looked at the map. She understood the shape of what he was telling her. The person who had downgraded the threat assessments had also been in communication with the network they were downgrading the assessments on, which was not incompetence, which was the other thing. You have a name, she said. We have a frequency signature, he said, and a unit and a rank. He turned the tablet over. On the back, written in block letters, on paper taped to the case, was a name. She read it. She read it again. She'd served with this person, not closely, not in the same section, but in the same forward operating base for 14 months. She'd been in briefings with this person. She'd trusted this person with the ordinary operational trust of people on the same side of a line. The room was quiet. How long, she said. Based on the earliest traffic, LeBrun said, 14 months. She looked at her bandaged hands. 14 months. The same 14 months she'd been here. The same 14 months of routes filed, patrols going out, assessments being revised, and a compound full of flatbed frames that the intelligence picture had decided not to see. The investigation has physical corroboration, LeBrun said. The frequency signature, the revision authorization logs, the transmission timing relative to your mission briefing. We move in 72 hours when the last evidentiary piece is in place. He paused. I'm told you want to be present. I want to be present, she said. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he took the paper off the back of the tablet, folded it, and set it on the tray table. 72 hours, he said. If your surgeon signs off. He left. She picked up the folded paper and held it, didn't open it. She didn't need to. The name was already indexed, stored with the same precision she'd kept everything. Ranges, scores, grid references, the sound of boots leaving in the dark. She thought about the 47 people south who had gotten up that morning and eaten breakfast. She thought about the flatbeds and the frame structures and the intelligence assessment that had called a weapons transit point a farm. She thought about the 14 months this had been running and the routes that had been filed and the specific arithmetic of how many missions had gone into the valley over 14 months and how many of those missions had gone wrong in ways that had been assessed as operational variants. She pressed the call button for the nurse. When the nurse appeared in the door, Colt said, I need to speak with my surgeon. I need to know exactly what I have to do to be mobile in 3 days. Not comfortable, mobile. The nurse looked at her rib brace. She looked at the IV line. She did the calculation. I'll get him, she said. The surgeon's name was TC, and he had the quality of a man who had been asked an unreasonable question before and had occasionally been surprised by the answer. He stood at the foot of the bed with the chart and looked at her numbers and looked at her. Your rib consolidation is ahead of the standard projection, he said carefully. Not significantly, but measurably. Enough to stand in a room, she said, for 30 minutes. Brace on. He looked at her for a long moment. Why do I have the feeling that standing in a room is not the full picture? Because you're good at your job, she said, and it is the full picture. I need to be standing in a specific room in 72 hours. That's all. He made the expression of a man who was revising his immediate professional inclinations in response to information he could not technically refute. He put the chart down. Brace, he said. Someone with you, and if your pain threshold tells you to sit down, you sit down. He paused. And Sergeant Colt, if I discover that standing in a room was a significant understatement of what actually occurred, your next week of recovery is going to be considerably less comfortable than it has to be. Are we clear? She said. He left. She reached for the physiotherapy schedule on the tray table and started reading it, because 72 hours was not much time, and she did not intend to waste any of it. The room was not what she'd expected. She'd expected something that fit the weight of what was about to happen, something that felt, architecturally, like consequence. What she got was a standard briefing room at FOB Gracefield. Table, chairs, a whiteboard that someone had used for something unrelated and not fully erased. 2 military police standing at the far wall with the professional neutrality of people whose job was to be present and unobtrusive. Shaughnessy at the head of the table. LeBrun off to the side with his tablet, and in the chair across the table from where Colt would stand, with his hands flat on the surface and his eyes tracking her entry with an expression she had never, in 14 months, seen him wear, Captain Nathan Ziegler, not the expression of a man who had made a decision in a valley and was accounting for it. Something older than that and more tired. The expression of someone who had been holding a version of themselves in position for a long time and had finally run out of the energy it required. Sergeant Colt, Shaughnessy said, take a seat. Colt didn't sit. She moved to the table, weight distributed through the brace, the way she'd practiced for 3 mornings, and she looked at Ziegler, and she gave him the full flat attention that she gave everything she'd decided to look at directly. You told them I was slowing you down, she said. His jaw tightened. You said it the way you say things that are already decided. She paused, and then you walked 4 kilometers to the fire base and filed a report that said the patrol's reconnaissance objective was unachievable due to hostile contact, and you listed me as a casualty. She kept her voice level. While I was inside that compound pulling intelligence that your filed routes were designed to make sure we never found. Something moved across his face, not denial, the more complicated thing. It wasn't, he said, and then stopped. What wasn't it, she said. The patrol route, he said. His voice was controlled, but underneath it was the particular rawness of something that had been compressed for a long time. I filed the route. He stopped again. I didn't think they'd hit us in the valley. I thought they'd turn us back at the tree line. I thought command would finally accept that the intelligence picture on this area was too degraded to run operations in, and they'd reassess. He filed a route, she said. He transmitted it on a domestic coalition frequency to a network he'd been in contact with for 14 months. And 47 people south would have been the consequence if the mission had just stayed failed. His hands were flat on the table, very still. Did you know what was on the flatbeds? She said. A pause. Ziegler, she said. Did you know what was on the flatbeds? He didn't answer. LeBrun at the side of the room didn't move. Shaughnessy was very still. The 2 MPs against the wall were professional about their stillness, but they were paying close attention. I didn't know the specifics, Ziegler said finally. I knew the convoy was significant. I didn't know what it was carrying. But you knew a convoy was coming through that compound. Yes, and you filed a route that would make sure we didn't reach it. He said nothing, which was the answer. She looked at him for a long moment. She'd served alongside him. She'd defended him once in a briefing, early in the second rotation, when a senior NCO had questioned his risk assessments, and she'd said Ziegler was thorough, that his caution was a function of precision rather than hesitation, that the unit was better for having someone who asked twice before committing. She'd meant it when she said it. She was looking for the version of what she was hearing that made sense in the same frame as the man she'd said that about. She didn't find it. What she found instead was the specific loss of a piece of the architecture you'd built your operational trust on, a piece you'd assumed was load-bearing because you'd never tested it. 14 months of working beside someone is not the same as knowing them. She'd known that in the abstract. Now she knew it specifically. The investigation, LeBrun said, beginning. His voice was level and procedural in the way of someone who had done this before. He laid out the signals evidence in sequence, the frequency signatures, the revision authorization logs, the transmission timing. He was methodical and thorough and did not hurry. Ziegler said very little. At one point, he asked for JAG counsel, and Shaughnessy confirmed the right immediately, as was required, and documented the request. When he did speak, it was in the compressed way of someone who has assessed the exits and found them all closed and is now determining what remains. At the end of it, the MPs moved. Ziegler stood. He looked at Colt one more time. She gave him nothing. Not anger, not contempt, not the satisfaction of any readable response. The same flat attention she'd been giving him since she walked into the room. She'd spent 9 years learning how to stand in rooms where people looked at her and saw something that needed to be accounted for, explained, assessed. She knew how to give nothing when nothing was what the situation required. They took him out of the room. The door closed. Shaughnessy came to stand beside her, not speaking immediately. The deliberate presence of someone who understood that the space after a door closes sometimes needs a moment before it gets filled. Okay, Colt said finally. It wasn't a question. It wasn't quite an answer. It was the word that fit the specific quality of the moment, the completion of something, with the knowledge that what came after it was already beginning. The network, LeBrun said from the table. He was closing his tablet with the contained focus of a man already thinking 3 steps forward, the nodes on the map. With Ziegler's identification and the signal's corroboration from your compound, we have enough to move on 2 of the remaining 4. He looked at her. The thread you pulled out of that valley is going to take months to follow completely. But we're following it. She nodded. She was looking at the empty chair. The 47 South, she said. Do they know? They were briefed on the threat summary this morning, LeBrun said. Not the full network picture. They know a convoy was intercepted. They know it was close. He paused. They'll know the full story when it's cleared for release. She thought about 47 people in a briefing room, hearing that last night had been close without knowing how close, or what the margin had looked like, or what specifically was on the slope of a valley in the dark, accounting for the difference between their Thursday and the other kind of Thursday. She thought about a drainage ditch and a shoulder she'd put back in herself, and the 4 kilometers of ground between her position and a compound she'd decided to approach uphill. She thought about the thing her demolitions instructor had said, the thing about destroying the thing versus making it impossible to move, and how it applied to more than just vehicles in a motor pool. How it applied to networks. How it applied to 14 months of careful management of an intelligence picture, and what happened when someone pulled a map off a wall and read it accurately. Shaughnessy spoke. Her voice had a different quality than it had at any point in the hospital. Something deliberate, the way people speak when they've decided that what they're about to say matters enough to be said carefully. You've been in this unit for 3 years, she said. Your qualification record goes back 9 years. She paused. Your first CO at Petawawa wrote in your assessment, and I'm telling you directly because it matters. Colt demonstrates a quality of operational reasoning that I have not encountered at this level. She should be considered for team leadership within 12 months. Colt said nothing. She knew there was more. You were not given team leadership within 12 months, Shaughnessy said. The recommendation was filed, it was reviewed, it was not acted on. She paused. Our records review as part of the investigation identified 14 months of personnel action suppression coinciding with Ziegler's tenure on this file. Not overt. Administrative. Requests that moved slowly, recommendations that were noted and deferred, a pattern that looked like bureaucratic friction and was in fact deliberate. The room was very quiet. He needed you where you were, Shaughnessy said. A Colt with her own team was outside his ability to manage. He kept you adjacent because adjacent was useful and constrained. She heard this. She let it land the way she'd let the 47 land, not immediately but fully with the specific weight of something true. 9 years of rooms where the expectation needed adjusting. 9 years of scores that needed to be reshot before anyone believed them. She'd attributed it to the ordinary friction of being what she was in the spaces she occupied. Some of that friction had been ordinary. Some of it had been Ziegler. She breathed through the anger the way she breathed through the ribs, not suppressing it, acknowledging it, filing it, deciding what to do with it later. What happens now, she said. Shaughnessy reached into the folder in front of her and produced 2 documents. She turned them to face Colt and slid them across the table. The first was a promotion order. Sergeant First Class to Warrant Officer Accelerated, citing exceptional operational conduct. The second was a unit activation order. Task Force designation. Joint operations with a signals intelligence element. 6 billets. Team lead slot with her name typed into it. The task force activation is contingent on medical clearance, Shaughnessy said. 8 weeks. Your surgeon projects. Team selection is yours. Full personnel roster. Any request not currently assigned to an active operation. She paused. The mission profile is the remaining network nodes. You know the intelligence better than anyone in this theater. You found it.
I want you to finish it.
Funk Colt read the activation order twice. She read her name in the team lead line, typed in standard military font, unremarkable to anyone who didn't know what it had taken to get it there. She thought about 9 years. She thought about a drainage ditch in the Panjshir Valley and a shoulder she'd set herself and 4 kilometers uphill in the dark. She thought about 47 people who had gotten up that morning and would go home to their families without ever knowing that the distance between that outcome and the other one had been measured in cracked ribs and field cord, and the kind of persistence that some people called stubbornness and some people eventually called something else. Yes, she said, one word. Complete and final, the way she made decisions that mattered. Shaughnessy nodded. LeBrun was already on his tablet, moving to whatever came next. Colt picked up the activation order. She looked at her name one more time. 8 weeks. 8 weeks of physiotherapy and personnel reviews and intelligence briefings and the slow work of bulldozing something from the authority she'd been handed and the understanding she'd accumulated and the thread she'd pulled out of a burning compound wall that was still going to lead somewhere. The remaining nodes on LeBrun's map were going to learn what the compound at the head of the valley had already learned, what the convoy had demonstrated by not arriving at its destination, what Ziegler was sitting in a room right now beginning to reckon with, that the most significant miscalculation you can make in any terrain and in any conditions is to look at Adrienne Colt and conclude that she's already done. She folded the activation order, placed it inside her jacket, and walked out of the briefing room under her own power. at a pace that was not quite what it had been 3 weeks ago and was getting closer every day. No one who saw her in that corridor would have known what she was carrying. The weight of 47 lives, the shape of a network that still needed dismantling, the names of 6 people she hadn't chosen yet who were going to become the best unit she'd ever lead. They would have just seen a soldier who knew exactly where she was going. Because she did.